All right, layout. So this is, for me, where CSS and styling is the most tricky. Getting things to show up on the page where you want them to, and to look reasonable, and to continue to look reasonable when you resize the screen or when you look at it on a mobile device. I think it's the trickiest part of styling. So we're going to look at the box model, so what the box model is, and then we'll look at some attributes that you'll use probably more than any other attributes, padding and margin. Border is another one that we just have to consider when we look at the box model. You have to understand that there's a border option there too. Then we'll talk about positioning, relative versus absolute, static, fixed. And we'll mention measurement units also in this presentation. And then I'm not going to talk about floating and clearing because we just don't have enough time today. So I've got some links that you can go look at to learn about it yourself. Floating is useful sometimes, but I'm going to suggest that using flex and grid and things like that are a better choice than using basic layout and things like floating and clearing, and less confusing once you understand flex and grid. So I'll leave it to you to look at that, and using Google Fonts is something that you'll likely want to do, but I'm not going to spend time talking about it because I don't think it's really hard to figure out. If you get stuck on how to use Google Fonts, let me know and I'll help you, but I've got a link there for you so that you can see how to do that. So today I'm going to focus on the things that I think are challenging to understand on your own, or even looking at resources online just because there's so much and it's really confusing. I'm going to focus on those things and we'll practice with those things today, and there might be some things that you need to go look at yourself, okay? If you find after today that there's still things that are really confusing, then let's talk about that and we can look at some more things next week if we need to, okay? All right, so Jai, there's a repo that you need to fork and clone down, okay? It's in the lesson channel. So here it is, this repo. This is the repo that you need to fork and clone. We're going to use the same repo for the 3 different things we talk about today. They're just subdirectories in that repo. All right, so let's start with talking about the box model. So block elements. Who knows what a block element is? What's an example of a block element?
Would it be like div and section?
Yeah, div and section and paragraph. Anchor tags. Are anchor tags block elements? I think they are. So no, anchor tags are in line, aren't they? Anchor tags are in line. Paragraph, div, so the 2 different categories are block elements and inline elements. Inline elements are one that will just appear on the same line unless you put breaks between them. And block elements are laid out sort of like vertically on the page. So if you have a div, the content in that div will appear. If you have another element below that div, it's going to appear below and not next to the div in the normal flow of things.
So it wraps around other elements in it.
Well, yeah, block elements, basically they take up the whole horizontal space that they're placed in, okay? So you don't have things block elements next to each other unless you force that with layout. But in the natural flow of things, block elements take up whole lines, horizontal lines, okay?
Headings are block elements?
Headings are block elements, yeah. So, and they stack up vertically. Right? So, and all block elements are rendered using this box model. So there's some content in the element. So this is, whatever you put in it, the text or an image or whatever is actually in the between the tags of the block element. That's the content. And then there's this padding, which is between the content and the border. And then between the border and any other element is a margin. So the margin is between block elements, okay, outside of the element itself, between it and other elements. So, and then when we refer to the sides of this box, whether we're adding padding or margin or border, we refer to the top, the right, the bottom, and the left, okay? And you'll see that sometimes we can specify all 4 of these things at the same time. And when we do it all 4 at the same time, the order is top, right, bottom, left, always. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So it's important to understand, and if you look in the developer tools and inspect, you'll see this box model down on the bottom. We'll look at that later. You'll notice that it shows it there, and it'll indicate to you what the padding, margin, and border values are and where those are coming from. But by default, everything is laid out according to this model with potentially with some browser presets. All right, so border is just the edge around the box, and border property values are specified as width, style, and color. So you can specify all 3 of those on a single line like this, or you can specify them according to which side of the box you're talking about. So you can say border top, this style and this color, or border right, this style and this color. Or you can specify the styles individually. You can say the border width is this, and the border style is this, and the border color is this. Okay? So with most CSS properties, not most, with a lot of CSS properties, there are multiple ways to specify those properties. There's you can specify each thing individually, or there'll be some shorthand for specifying a group of related properties. So for example, we can specify everything about border in one line with the border property. So let's see, we have some examples here. Oh, we're going to try it, actually. Okay, so what I want you to do is first let's have a look. Let's have a look here. Let's have a look at this. So we can, for example, have a solid border. We can have a dashed red border. Looks like that. We can specify a width of the border and the style. So one rim, we'll talk about measurements later. Okay, so leave that for the moment. Solid. We can specify the thickness, the style, and the color all at once, like this. So this is a thick double border, that's this blue color. We can also specify the color with RGB or with CMYT. Did I say those letters in the right order? Or any way we can specify color, we can put there. Okay? So if we're going to specify all the elements, the order is thickness or width, style, then color. And if we specify all of them with a single tag, then it's going to apply to all 4 sides of the box. Okay? So that's one way that we can specify border. So we call this a shorthand property when we can specify multiple things at once. And as you can see here, some of these have things omitted, and those will just be set to the initial value. So the initial value is its default value. Sometimes it's determined by some browser defaults, depending on the property. Sometimes it's just the default value listed in its definition table in the specification. So don't get too far down that track, okay? Just know that you don't have to specify all 3 properties. You can specify one of those properties, and if you do that, then the other 2 will take defaults, okay? If you do want to specify more than one, then you should put them in the correct order, okay? So you can also, let's see. So this is just showing border by itself. So if we look up, oh, there we're right there. Okay, so we can also look up, we can also specify just border width if we want, and that's going to apply to all 4 sides, unless we specify multiple values. So Remember when I said if we specify multiple values, the order that it's going to take those in is top, right, bottom, left. And if we only specify 2 values related to the box model, then the first value relates to top and bottom, and the second value relates to right and left. Okay? So for this first one that just says thick, it's going to apply to all 4 sides. The second one that says 1 EM is going to apply to all 4 sides. This third one, that's 4 pixels and 1.25 EM, the 4 pixels is going to refer to which sides?
Top and bottom.
Top and bottom. And the 1.25 EM will refer to left and right. Okay? And what about this one where we have 3 values? So if we have 3 values, then it does top. The second value is left and right. And the third value, no, that's not right. The first value is top. See, I don't even know what this is. Use left and right, and the bottom is,
left and right,
and the third value. Don't do this, okay? This would be confusing to anybody who looked at it. Like, just don't do that.
Either do 2 or 4.
Do 2 or 4, exactly, or 1. 1, 2, or 4. Don't do 3, okay? If you need to have the third one be a different size, then do that with a specific, border bottom or something, and override what you have the bottom border set to. All 4, or do all 4. If you want to be different, just do 4. Like, it's only like a few more keystrokes. It's not a big deal.
So it goes right and left. I thought it would go to left and right.
No, because it goes around clockwise.
It goes around.
Yes.
Clock.
Yes. Okay, so now having known this, let's go back and try this. So in your CSS file, here we're modifying the CSS file. Everybody see the CSS file here? Okay, so here's the CSS file, and what I want you to do is add a 3-pixel solid border that's red to the blue section, and a 5-pixel dotted border that's black to the yellow section, and a 3-pixel solid black border to the top and bottom of the red section. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. Just do them one at a time. You're going to add it to the CSS. So just somebody tell me for this first one, 3-pixel solid border that's red to the blue section, where do I add that in my CSS? Yes, and #1. So if you look at the HTML, each one of these sections I've labeled with an ID. All right? And so I'm using that ID to style those sections a particular way.
A red border around the blue.
Red, 3-pixel solid red border to the blue section.
You can barely see it.
3-pixel solid border that's red. Is it hard to see?
You put the semicolon on the line.
So I just
Is it dotted or dashed?
It's dotted? Yeah, I'd have to look it up.
Dashed.
Is it dashed? Yeah, it's dashed.
That's something I should be doing. Blue one?
3 solid black to the bottom. Top and bottom.
Yeah, you have all this stuff. How'd you call it stuff?
Okay, so somebody tell me what I can add for the first one, a 3-pixel solid border that's red to the blue section. Yes, Sam?
Border, colon, solid,
No, 3
space,
Mm-hmm.
3 pixels.
3px.
3px should go first, that's right.
3px
Yeah.
and then solid.
Yeah.
So it's red.
So it's thickness or width, then style, then color. So let's have a look at that. Yep. That looks right. And notice how it adds to the size of the box. My box is now bigger,
Yeah.
right? So that's something to note about border, that it adds to the size of your box. Okay, what about the second one? A 5-pix dotted border that's black to the yellow.
So 5px dash border, 5px dash black.
There we go.
And then
And the third one was
the third one I had.
3-pix solid black
So I did it with
to the top and bottom of the red.
bottom
Yeah.
top,
Yeah, so border,
border top,
border top.
3px solid black. And then I did border bottom, 3px solid and black. Because
There we go.
I'm not really sure how to tag them in one. 'Cause
Yeah, that's how I would do it, honestly,
Yeah.
because that's, I mean, there might be another way to do it, but I think that that's explicit and clear and, yeah.
It's like
All right, cool. Does anybody have any questions about that bit?
because you can't combine them, can you?
I don't think so. I wouldn't anyway.
CSS.
All right, so let's talk about padding. Padding is the space between your content and the border. That's what padding is. So you can specify it just like border in a number of different ways. So you can say padding, colon, and then what you want for all of them. So for example, 3 pixels or 1 EM or something, and that one value will apply to all 4 sides of the box. Or you can do top, right, bottom, left. Or you can do, or you can do 2 values where the first value is top, bottom, and the second value is right, left. Or you can specify the 4 different sides individually. Okay? So, here's an example where we have 10 for the top, 20 for the right, 30 for the bottom, and 40 for the left. Okay? And it'll go between the content and the border. So let's try this. 50 pix of padding on all sides of the blue section, 80 picks of padding to the left and right, and 40 picks of padding to the top and bottom of the yellow, and 20 picks of padding to the top and bottom of the red. Oops. No commas. No commas. Oops. There it is.
Oh, okay,
Okay, so somebody tell me 50 picks of padding on all sides of the blue section. What do I need to add?
Just padding column 40 picks.
I think it was 50. Was it 50?
50, sorry.
40 picks
Yeah.
it was.
No, I think for the first one it's 50.
It's 40
50.
It's 50.
Yeah.
Alright.
All right. So that makes it look like this. So you can see that that also added to the size of the box, right? And it added space between my content and the border. All right, the next one, 80 picks to the left and right and 40 picks to the top and bottom of the yellow. So how do I do that?
Adding 0 to 40.
Say that again.
So you go padding, 40 picks.
Top and bottom, yep. Top and bottom is 40. So top and bottom first.
And then 80.
Yep, so top and bottom is first, is the first number. Left and right is the second number. So if I add that to the yellow, then you can see the top and bottom. You can see it in the top because I've got the text at the top. Okay, and the third one is 20 picks to the top and bottom of the red. So how do I do that?
So padding top, padding bottom, 20 picks.
Top. Keep doing that. Okay, and that adds 20 picks to the top and bottom of the red section. You can't really see it's on the bottom. We're just going to trust that it's there. But we could see. How could we see? If we look at inspect. If we look at inspect, we could see. So here's the box model. See it? Ooh, look at that. Looks just like my picture. Okay, so if we look at the red box, then we three is the red box. Then you can see it actually shows you in the little box model that I've got 20 padding on the top and bottom, and I have a 3 pixel border. And then you can see when you mouse over the padding, see how it highlights the padding in the red section? So we can see it there and what that looks like. And it highlights the border. It's a little bit harder to see because my border's thin. If we go up to the yellow box, we can see that we've got 40 top and bottom, 80 left and right. There's our 5 pixel border. So it's really handy to use this little box. If something's not, if the padding or something doesn't look right, then you can look at this, or the margin a lot of times doesn't look the way you expect. You can look at this and figure out where it's coming from. And then we can see here's our styles here. We can see that they're coming from our CSS. And here you could, for example, turn them off if you want to, right? So it's nice to use the inspect tools for stuff like that. All right, any questions about padding? Is that pretty clear? All right. Margin. The margin is a transparent area around the box that separates it from other elements. So similar to padding, margin can be specified the same way. We can give the margin for all four sides with one value. We can specify the four sides individually, top, right, bottom, left, or two values where the first one's top and bottom, second one's left, right, and left, or we can specify each one of them individually. So margin has an auto setting as well, and what that does is it'll have it take up all available space in that on that side. Okay? So if we say margin auto, then what we're saying is in the flow of this layout, whatever that is, take up all the space that you can. Okay? If we say margin left is auto, then it's saying on the left-hand side, take up all the space that you can. So what this effectively does is push it all the way to the right. This element will be pushed all the way to the right. The margin on the left will take up all the available space in the flow that element is currently in. Okay? And if we say margin right auto, it's effectively pushing it all the way to the left. Okay? And so if we just say margin auto, it's like centering it in the space. So it's setting as much margin as it can on all sides, which effectively centers the element in the space that it can be in, right? So you'll see that people use margin auto to center things when we are allowing sort of the natural flow to dictate where items are going. Then we can use margin auto to center things or shift them over to the right or the left. Okay? So let's try it. So the first one is to center the blue section horizontally. Okay? Now, that can sound tricky because horizontally sort of implies that left and right, it's centered, and top and bottom it's not. But because our items are in a normal flow, they're going to stack one on top of the other. So by setting margin auto is not going to create any space around the top and bottom because there is no space by default on the top and bottom. Because by default, block items flow one right underneath the other, directly, one right under the other. So unless we allocate more space between the items explicitly, they're not going to take up any more space top to bottom. So if we set margin auto on a block item element that's in the natural flow, it's just going to center it horizontally. Okay? So we can center horizontally just with margin auto. Okay, go ahead and try that and you'll see.
Really?
Yeah. Does it center it horizontally?
Oh, I love spelling error. That one.
Yes. You know what? That'll get you so much in CSS. You'll spell one property wrong or something. Like you'll have the tiniest little spelling error. It won't tell you there's anything wrong. It'll be like, yeah, it's all good, man. It's all good. It's perfect. And then your style's not there, and you're like, why? Why are you doing this to me? And it's because you like transposed two letters or forgot a letter. It's really annoying. It's one of the reasons I don't like CSS.
Yes, sometimes you can't work. Why is it not doing what I want it?
Yes. All right, so the first one I gave to you, right? Did everybody observe that that was true if I set margin auto? That it centers it horizontally. Yeah, I'm going to close this for the moment. Now notice that it'll center it in the space it's got. So when I had this open over here, see how it centers it in that space? Because the viewport just got smaller. So it's going to center it in the space that it's got to be in, which means that if I change the size of my browser, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. If I change the size of my browser, it's going to keep centering it, okay? All right, so the next one was 5 pix margin around all sides of the yellow. So what do I need to do for that?
Margin column 40 pix.
Was it 40? 50.
Oh, 50.
You keep saying
Why am I
40.
doing that?
So that just puts an explicit 50 pixel margin around the yellow box, okay? Next was right justify the red section with a 220 pix right margin. So how can we do that? How can we use margin, how can we use the auto property? So we'll set margin left to what?
Order.
To auto. And how do we get 220 pix on the right side? So if we just set margin left to auto on the yellow box, so if we just, oops, was it yellow? No, it was red. Okay. Red. Okay, so on the red box, if we just say margin left auto, that pushes it all the way up against the right side. Okay? So that margin, setting margin left to auto just forces it all the way over to the right side. So if I wanted 220 pix margin on the right side, how can I do that?
Margin right, 220 pix.
Yes, that's right. And then that's going to put it 220 pix from the right side of the screen. So if I resize this, it's going to hold that 220 pix between it and the right side, but the left side is just going to kind of shrink and grow with however much space is available. Okay, the left margin will take up as much space as it can. Okay, and so what if I want to left justify the image with 100 pix on the left margin? So how do I do that?
Same thing. You just did that, but opposite. Margin right, auto, margin left. What is it, 100 pix?
20. No. What did I say? 100. Yes. Okay, so now our image is over here. So 100 pix.
From section 4.
Say again?
Oh, you're right.
So it's 100 pix from the left side, and it'll stay there. And notice that I can't make my window any smaller than this.
Yeah, so in this situation, I don't think you need to put the other margin, is it? Yes, so Sarah,
We don't. Well, if we had other stuff on the page, then we might need to. But the way that it is now, we don't necessarily need to. We could just set margin left because it's going to be by default. It's going to be left justified, right? By default, it is anyway. So we don't actually need margin right auto.
not many browsers that are smaller than 250.
Yeah.
And the image is not required.
That's right. That's right. So you could certainly, in this particular case, the margin right auto isn't doing anything at all, and we could just leave it off. That is true. All right. Any questions about that? About margin? All right. So let's talk about positioning. Positioning gets to be a little bit tricky. So by default, positioning is static. HTML elements use static positioning. And that means that inline elements, remember what's inline elements again? What are inline elements?
Bold and italic.
They're like they line up on the same line unless you put an explicit break. They occur on the same line. That's an inline element. So inline elements will flow from left to right, and block elements will flow from top to bottom. Okay? So that's the way that if you don't do anything, that's the kind of positioning you get. All right? Static. which is the default. That's right. So static positioned elements don't respond to the top, bottom, left, and right CSS properties for positioning. So I'm talking about the top property, the bottom property, the left property, and the right property. Okay? So you can use those properties to set the distance one element is from another element. But if the positions are statically, if the elements are statically positioned, they ignore those properties. It doesn't make any sense because those top, bottom, left, and right only make sense when they're relative to something else. Okay? So in order to make use of those position properties, top, bottom, left, and right, we have to use something other than static positioning. Okay? So we have relative positioning. Relative positioning we specify by saying position : relative in our CSS file for an element or for a class or whatever in our styling. So position relative means that we keep it in the natural flow, but it can be positioned relative to its normal position in the flow. So if we have an element that has relative positioning and we set a top of 5 pixels, then that is going to set the top of that element 5 pixels
From the bottom of the previous.
down from its normal position. So whatever its normal position would be in the normal flow, it's going to be 5 pixels, its top is going to be 5 pixels lower than that normal positioning. Okay, so relative positioning is positioning relative to where it would be in the normal flow if we weren't trying to place it specifically. So for example, the normal top position of an element is 0. Setting it to a positive number, the element is moved down that number of pixels relative to its normal position. If you set it to a negative number, which you can do, then it's going to move it up that number of pixels or units relative to its normal position. Okay? So let's try it. Let's move the red section to the right of the yellow section using position relative and the top property to move it upwards from its normal position. Okay? So let's have a look. So we're saying we want to move the red section. So here's the red section. And it's really annoying. Stop. So here's the red section, and we want to move it to the right of the yellow section, so we want it to be like up here. Okay? If you're using static flow, there's no way to do that because these are block elements, and they're going to sit one on top of the other. So we've got to change it from static positioning if we want to force that behavior without using something like flex or grid. Okay? So again, what we want to do is we want to move it to the right using the relative property, using the relative positioning and the top property to move it upwards from its normal position. So I didn't say how far up it should go. I just want it to be on the right side of the yellow box. So you can get into this position, and this is why we use flex and grid and not this sort of craziness to position items, because you got to actually do maths here. If you want to work out, if say you wanted it to be like right in the middle, then you're going to have to do some addition and subtraction to work out where is the bottom line of this thing sitting and where is the top line of this thing sitting, and how far up do I need to move this one to make it show up in the middle. Now, I'm not interested in that nonsense. Yeah, that's silly, okay? But you will find people who write their CSS to position things this way. And then you should have words with those people now. You can do what you want to do. But I would not choose to do that, which is why we're going to talk about flex and grid this afternoon. Because this to me is just crazy. It's shenanigans.
So how do
It
you
is.
do that?
Before we had flex and grid, that's what you had to do.
So do you go position, relative?
So we set position relative on which element? Which element do we need to set position relative on?
Red.
On the red one, yeah. Yeah, which is 3, I think.
Yeah.
So we set position relative on 3, and what that allows us to do is to say, I want the top of this thing.
Position relative 3.
So we just say position relative, that's one line. That sets the positioning of this element to be relative instead of static. And then we're going to have another line where we set top equal, is it going to be a positive or a negative number?
Negative.
It's negative.
A negative number, so that we can move it up. Okay?
If you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can have a play with it or you can do the math. So I'll leave it up to you. I would probably have a play because I'd be like, I'm not about to do that. That sounds like a pain. So we'll have to set the position to relative. And then we'll set the top. Let's try a number. What do we want to try first?
250.
250?
I think it's about 280.
Yeah. So that puts it definitely to the right. So let's see what 280 looks like. Yep, that's almost in line with the top of it. So given the instructions, either one of those is acceptable, right? But you get the idea. We just set its positioning to relative, and then we can manipulate it relative to its static position, its normal
It doesn't
position.
matter where you put that. It's not going to move anything else because it's the only thing that's relative.
It's the only thing that's relative. That's right. So it doesn't impact anything else.
So if you scroll down, there's still like a block. If you look at your
Inspect, yeah.
you can actually see the overlap. When you click on that highlighter,
See what it does here? And when it runs out of room, right? When it runs out of room on the,
It's gonna put it on top.
because what do we have set for the margin on this red box? Do you remember?
Or
Auto, which says just take up as much room as you can on the left. And as soon as I made this a viewport, and I said you've got to give me 220 pixels on the right. Okay? So that's like hard coded. 220 pixels on the right. As soon as we make the viewport small enough, it starts to overlap the yellow box. Okay? So it's like has no respect for that positioning of that yellow box or anything else. Okay?
if you scroll down, you can see the gap where it's supposed to sit.
You can.
It's supposed to be something in there still, and it's still like an
That's right. That's right. So yes, it doesn't affect this. This doesn't move up into its space. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you can see how this would quickly get like really sort of nightmarish, you know, trying to make your website layout using properties like this. Like you'd have to be pretty clever about it.
You sort
You
of
know?
understand how some of the older websites got made now.
Yes.
This was very limited in how they could maneuver stuff around.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's look at the next one. Said, oh wait, I didn't cut.
That's one of the reasons why you designed the mobile first. You start
Yes.
you design the website up, browse the desktop.
Yes.
And you have to start absolute positioning things.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely true. Definitely true. Which is why I mentioned when we talked about portfolio, just trust me when I say do mobile first, and you will just save yourself so much frustration, because it rarely is going to be like absolutely terrible if you develop for mobile first and then look at it on a big screen. Like it might not be ideal, but it's not going to be, like it's still going to be usable. You know what I mean? But if you start from full size and then try to like show it in mobile version, it's not going to be usable most times. You know, you have to change it to make it even usable. And because almost everybody is looking at content on a device now, you know, much more likely than looking at it on a laptop or full screen. Okay, so if we want to move, did I say? Okay, so now let's move the red section to the right of the green section using the top property to move it down. Okay, so right now it's here, and we can have a play with it in here as well, right, can't we? So if I pick this section, and I see right now I've got the top at -280. If I wanted it to be over to the right of the green section, what would I change it to? So if I set it back, if I toggle this one off, I want to let me do that. Why won't it let me do that?
Mouse over the side of it, and should the picture come up
Over,
over the side where the text would be.
yeah. It's not happening for me.
Doesn't happen on mine.
I don't know what's going
Or you
on.
can just click on it and turn it to 0.
You gotta click on it.
I'm
and
trying.
then you mouse over
It
it.
won't.
Click on the red box and then mouse over it.
So it should, see, it's here. Yeah. It's just not working for me. Hold on.
Doesn't like it.
Mine will automatically come up when I'm on section 3.
What?
Okay, I don't know why that's happening. So what do I have to change it to? What should we try?
I did top 180.
180? Yep. So that moved it to the right of the green section. So just by manipulating top, we can move it up or down. Noticing that it still left the space, it didn't affect the flow of the other elements. Right. Absolute positioning. So what is absolute positioning? Well, when an element has absolute positioning, it's outside of the normal flow. An absolutely positioned element is offset from its container block. Okay? Positioned relative to its container block. So whatever it is that contains that element, which might be the page itself, okay? If it's not contained within another inline or another block element, then it could be the page itself. But an absolutely positioned element is offset from its container block. If its container block is its container block is the first element that has a position other than static. So even if it's contained within another block, if that element has static positioning, then it's the block above it, and so forth, until we get to something that is not statically positioned. Okay? So what we use absolute positioning for is to position something relative to this absolute position thing, generally. Okay? So the way we use absolute positioning is we'll set absolute positioning on one block element, and then we'll set relative positioning on another block element that's a descendant of that block element, and then we can position that child element relative to the absolutely positioned element. Okay, so let's look at let's look at an example. So if we want to move the green section to the top of the page over the blue section using absolute setting top and left properties. So right now the green section is here, and we want it to be up here over the blue section. So first, what happens if we just set it to absolute? Let me see if it'll play with me now if I do it in here.
Click the plus on the.
Yeah.
Can you edit in there now?
Yeah, I can edit in here. Okay, so if I just...
Taking it out of the...
It takes it out of the flow.
Yeah.
It takes it out of the flow. And then I can say top
You just hit 0.
Yep. And that positioning is relative to the container that is not statically positioned, which since it's not in any other container, it's going to be relative to the page itself.
With the you don't need to put the pixels when you just put 0.
You don't have to. No, you can just say 0. So if we set it to 0, and then, what did I say, using the left? Yeah, left. So if I set left to And it'll depend because this blue one has an auto margin.
What happens
Right.
if you put left auto and right auto?
Let's try.
That's the same thing as
Now, if we did margin, not,
Left margin.
yeah, if we did margin left. It doesn't do anything.
It's because it's not in a container.
It's not, that's right, that's right. So, we've taken it out of the flow, so that's, well, it's because it's not in a,
It's like in the normal flow.
Mm.
It takes up all space.
It takes
so
up the
it's
whole
taken out of-
we've taken it out of the normal flow. So there's no auto margin. So if we do left, so the point being with that one that absolute positioning takes it out of the normal flow and positions it relative to its container block, where a container block is the first element that has a position other than static, or the HTML element if there isn't one. So if I take that off, it's still, so it is over the top of it. You can see that if we wanted it to stay in a position, a particular place over that blue box, we wouldn't want to have auto margins on the blue box, because we wouldn't want the blue box to move around.
Have you set
Or
it relative, like we'd have to change the HTML, but set it relative to the blue box, so that would follow the blue box?
So when you say change the HTML, what do you mean?
I don't know, I have to figure it out.
So if we wanted to sell it, so this is where the next slide comes into play. Okay, so if we set absolute positioning on the blue box and relative positioning on the green box, then we can position the green box relative to the blue box, and that's the way we typically use absolute positioning is in conjunction with relative positioning to position one element relative to the position of another element. So let's look at that, because that's really where it makes sense. It doesn't really make sense to position something absolutely on its own otherwise, and you can see why, right?
Except for maybe a nav bar at the top.
Yeah, it could be for a nav bar.
Something down the bottom that you want to be.
Yeah, something that you just want to stick to the top or bottom, where you know you're going to place other elements, you know, so that they don't overlap with that thing. Yeah. So let's look at this example, though, because this is a pretty useful example, using relative and absolute together. So if you specify a container with relative positioning, you can control placement of an element in that container with absolute positioning. So I think I said it backwards the first time. The positioning of the absolute element will be relative to the container in which it's positioned. So that relative to its block container, or its container block. So one example is placing a caption on an image. The image would be in a container with relative positioning, and the caption would have absolute positioning. And then you would use top, right, left, and bottom to position that absolute positioned object inside or relative to the relative positioned object. Okay? So let's look at doing that. Let's, in the HTML, add a paragraph element to the image section. Okay, so a paragraph, you know how to add one of those? With ID equals caption. So we're going to stick an ID on it so we can style it in the CSS. And the text of the paragraph is Anais Nin, so she's the woman in the picture.
How do you spell that?
A-N-A-I-S, yeah, Nin. So I also want you to make, so you're going to create that in the, that's all that goes in the HTML. Okay, paragraph tag, ID equals caption, the text, the content of the paragraph is Anais Nin. Then go to the CSS, make the font color for the caption white, position the image relatively, Position the caption paragraph absolute. Yep. So if you just read this for a moment, if you stop for a minute and read this, what do you think I'm trying to accomplish here? So we have that picture is like mostly black, right? And we'll have this white caption, and where am I trying to put it? I mean, this pretty much says where, right? 10 picks from the left side and 10 picks from the bottom. So like just sort of at the bottom left, you know, with just a tiny bit of padding there, you know, between the caption and the left side and the bottom. So that's what we're trying to do.
Caption thing already, so make one.
You have to make one. That's right. So you're going to have to add the paragraph tag, and you're going to have to add a CSS specification for the caption ID.
What color is it?
Okay, so let's
How do you make font color?
color. Remember from yesterday, color is what sets the font color. Hmm? Is it too small now? I was going to grab it and stick it in my CSS or my that's all right. Okay, so HTML, in my image section, what do I need to add? So in the HTML, I'm going to add a paragraph, right, with an ID equal caption, and the text Anaïs, right? And then in my style, I know I'm going to have, I'm just going to put it here in the image, I'm going to have some CSS for the caption ID. And one thing I said was to set the color to white. Okay, so if we just add that first, and then I look, okay, this is where it is by default. Okay, so this is just static positioning, natural flow. It's a paragraph that's a child of the section, so it appears on top of it, and by default it's going to be at the top left corner. Okay? Alright, so now I want to move it, and in order to move it and keep it, I want to keep it in the same spot. If I change the size, if I move the image around, I want the caption to stay in the same place, right? I don't want the caption to fall off the image if I, you know, move the image around. So in order to accomplish that, I'm going to set position relative on the image, which shouldn't change anything. Okay? And then I'm going to set position absolute on the caption, which still shouldn't change anything yet. Okay? And now I want to move it down to the bottom. So remember that now the positioning that I give with my position attributes, top left, bottom right, are going to be relative to the container block, which is my image section. Okay? So it's relative to that. All right? So if I set, what did I say to set? Which ones did I say to set? I just have to remind myself. Oh, I didn't say. Okay. So if I want to move this caption so that it's 10 pixels from the left side, how could I do that? 10 pixels from the left side of the image. Not margin. I'm going to use positioning. Yeah, I'll use left because that's going to be relative to the image. So I'll say left 10 pixels, right? Now if I look at what that did was, say again? Maybe I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. It still didn't do anything. Let's have a look here. What's going on? Did I? It has. Oh, see, this is what I'm talking about, people. It's so annoying. But if you go look at the inspector, right, it pretty clear. It comes up pretty clearly. You realize pretty quickly what the problem is.
Sometimes you could use I use a tab and then you can select from a menu.
Yeah.
What's your green one set to now? What did you do with the green one?
Yes.
And red one? Because my green one's at the top.
It should be up at the top. I must have done something.
You just did it in the inspector, probably.
Oh, I did just do it in the inspector. Yeah. It's because I didn't do it in here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. So now I want it. So right now it's still at the top though, but it's 10 pixels. We can see that right here. And if we look at the inspector and we look at the image, we look at the caption, then we can see that, why is this over here? This is really annoying. I don't know why this is what that is. What's happening there? I think that's why I can't edit. It's really annoying. Okay. So, here. Stop. Okay. So I'm trying to see the box. I don't know why this is like
If you
this.
just close it and reopen it, it should set right.
Okay, well, all right, so let's try to put it at the bottom. So what do you think I should do? Should just be able to say 10 pixels, right? And that'll be relative to the bottom. Now, let me look at my CSS. If you comment this out, that wasn't supposed to be in this one. Comment out that reset that I've got at the top. See at the top of your CSS, I have this margin and padding reset. That's not supposed to be in there because I want to talk about that. So take that out and look what happens. See that? That doesn't look like 10 pixels.
Control / still works.
Right? And if I look at it, I can see that I've got this this margin working here. Yeah, right? That's what I'm saying. So if you look, you can see where it's coming from. It's coming from paragraph. See this? Margin before, margin after.
So by default,
Yeah,
paragraph has a margin.
it does.
So you've got to clear that.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't have to do that.
You didn't. So I think it's
Web.
browser and browser version and everything else. So different browsers won't look it won't have exactly the same thing.
That's why you use CSS clear. So at the top you say margin 0, and then you set all the margins from there.
Yeah, so that's why it's not clear exactly. Clear is something different, but I call this a reset. Right, remember when I asked yesterday, well, you weren't here yesterday, but I asked Jamie yesterday what she does about this. Does she use a reset CSS or normalize or something else? And she said that, she rarely has to worry about it because she never starts anything from scratch because she works for a company. So she's always working on something that somebody else has started already. But at a minimum, this isn't going to hurt anything, okay? If you stick this at the top of your CSS file, do you remember yesterday Jamie said about how using the all-inclusive, the splat to indicate styling doesn't have any point. So it's not going, anything else that you do is going to override this, but it just starts you off with 0 padding and 0 margin because it's somewhat common for browser defaults to include some kind of margin or padding around certain elements. And then you'll be doing your CSS and like, why isn't my caption 10 pixels from the bottom? I'm telling it to be 10 pixels from the bottom. So when I add that and save it, you can see it gets rid of that margin before, margin after bit. Although it's
There's
still
a different thing, like the choice that you can make
it's
is
gone.
not doing it at the top and completely overriding all the browser's content. But say, you only really wanted it for one element, you have to set it. You can set it in that element alone.
You
know
could.
what I mean? Like if you have
Yes.
other content on the browser, on
Yes.
the page that you didn't want to be affected by it.
You could. So, but the thing is that this little reset isn't going to hurt because if you want, anything that you put after that, if you put it at the top of your file, anything you put after that's going to override it.
So I'm talking in terms of accessibility. So some people have large fonts.
Yes.
Because they need it to read. And
Yes.
then when they go to a website that's overwritten the size of all the fonts,
Yes.
then they don't get the same accessibility on it.
Yes, that's true. So you do have to be careful when you're using reset CSS or, some CSS that somebody's written to kind of get rid of
Everything.
all of the browser defaults. Yeah, so I think it's better to choose the own things that your own things that you want to override. Normalize CSS, which I mentioned. Here, I'll just go to these slides. So resetting browser defaults. This is the one that I just talked about. It's not going to hurt anything to do these two in particular. Okay, isn't going to hurt anything. But another popular alternative that you'll see is people use normalized CSS. So attempt has been made to preserve useful defaults, like those related to accessibility and things like that, in normalized CSS. It normalizes styles for a whole bunch of elements, and it corrects bugs and common browser issues. So you can download it and then include it in your projects, as a CSS file. Or you can use the CDN. Is anybody familiar with CDNs already? Content Delivery Systems. Yeah? So it's just a link, basically, that you include. You'll just copy the link to include, and it's going to go grab it from somewhere.
In the HTML. Is it in the meta of the HTML?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. And so that's how you incorporate Bootstrap and Materialize and things like that too.
When would you use the CDN versus hosting the stuff on your own server? Or JavaScript?
I always use the CDN, but
It's easier to write a line of code than just go and download it and put it in your file system.
it is. And depending on how you're hosting your stuff, you may want to reduce the load of what you're hosting yourself. And then if they change normalized CSS, so one of the good or bad things, right, is if they make an improvement that you want to take advantage of, then it's automatically there if you use the CDN. But then if they make some improvement that breaks your stuff, then you automatically get that too. So there are those trade-offs. You have more control if you download it, then okay, I tested with this specific code, right?
Yeah.
If you use the CDN, then there's potential that.
Yeah, and I guess if you're more confident in your own hosting than their servers, then you always know that it's going to be
Yeah,
possible.
yeah. So if you're worried about the availability of where it's hosted from, yeah, then you might want to do it yourself. So I think for myself, it's mostly out of laziness that I always just use the CDN. So
You don't sacrifice any speed or anything for additions, they're generally.
yeah, and look, you'll find that any particular content will be hosted by a bunch of different places. Like there isn't one place to get the normalized CDN. You know, there'd be like a bunch of them. So you can kind of look for ones that are highly rated or, you know, are known to be more robust or available or whatever. Yeah. All right, so fixed positioning. An element with a fixed position is positioned relative to the viewport, which means it always stays in the same place even if you scroll the page. It's like stuck there, okay? And the top right, bottom, and left properties are used to position it. Okay, so let's look at that. You might use this to stick something like a nav bar or a footer or like a menu, a nav, a left, or right side nav or left side nav or something like that. You might use it for that. So there's an aside section. Use that fixed positioning to place it on the right of the page, the right side of the page, 100 pixels from the top of the page, and 10 pixels from the right side. So not quite up all the way to the right side, 10 pixels from the right side, and make it fixed so it stays there. So here's the aside, this purple block here, and we want it to be fixed on the right with 10 pixels between it and the right side of the page and 100 pixels from the top. So how do we do that? Anybody tell me? So what does the position need to be?
Fixed.
Yep. And then
Just top 100 fps, left 10 fps.
okay. And did I say the left side, right side? Yeah. That's all right. I was like, I meant right. Oh, I did. Jeez. I'm like, wait, it's not moving. Yeah. Okay. Yay. All right. So that you see it stays stuck there. It's not going to move.
I like it that mistakes are being made because you learn from them.
Yeah, definitely. I make mistakes all the time. All the time. And most of the time I learn from them, so that's good. Okay,
The
so
red box is got something relative to it.
all right. Good stuff. Okay, so let's talk briefly about measurements. So we have different measurement units that we can use for font size, for line size, for padding, for margin, for top, left, right, bottom, for borders, right? There are a lot of different properties in CSS that specify some size or thickness or something, okay? So one way that we can do it is using absolute units. So that's what we've been doing today. Absolute units are things like pixels or inches or centimeters or
M's or rims.
no, those are relative units,
Alright.
right?
If you use centimeters
Yes,
and you measured it on your phone or browser, it would be that centimeters.
should be. Yes,
If everything's
Yes.
right.
that's right.
Wow.
That's right. So absolute measurements are fixed and not dependent on the browser size or any default settings or anything else, right? They're just absolute measurements. The most common absolute length is pixels, but some people like to use centimeters or think you can use millimeters. Let's see if I have one. I don't have the list of them on here, but I have a link so you can go look at them. Okay, so that's one type of measurement. The other type of measurement, which has gotten to be more and more popular, is relative measurements. So relative measurements specify a length that's relative to another length property. Okay, so these are units that are becoming more popular with responsive design because, you know, if you set a font size for, you know, particular viewport size, for example, in this particular section, and you want to size spacing between components relative to that font size, maybe, then you can use these relative measurements. So, for example, if you you know, have this section that when you put it on a mobile, maybe you want the text to be slightly bigger because it, you know, I was looking at a site this morning, actually, the ATO website, and it was terrible. I was looking at it on my phone, and the font was like microscopic, you know, and I had to, like, you know, zoom it to be able to see, and then I had to, like, move the whole thing around to be able to read. It was so annoying, so annoying. So you might want to have, you know, a slightly larger font on a mobile. And if you've got spacing, like say you have padding, you know, in this element, you don't want to set it to like an absolute size, and then your font size gets bigger, and suddenly you've got like content in this tiny little square with all this space around it, you know. So with responsive design, it can make sense to use relative measurements. It makes more sense, especially if you're kind of changing the size of things that you're displaying when you change viewport size.
You don't have to do the maths for it then.
And then you don't have to do the maths, yeah, which is nice.
You write the relative size once, you don't have to write each individual media.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. So some of the common relative measurements are EM. You've probably seen EM before. And EM is relative to the font size of the element. Okay? That particular element, okay, where you're using this relative sizing, where you're saying 1 EM or 2 EMs, whatever the font size is for that element, which is going to depend on any number of things, okay? So it could be the default font size, unless you've overridden that. If you're using normalized CSS, it's going to be set to something. You might have set the font size for the whole page, you know, for body. You may have set the font size for one of the container blocks for this element. So whatever the font size is for this particular element where you're using EM, an EM measurement is going to be relative to that font size. Okay? So that's why some people like to use REM, which will be relative to the font size of the HTML element. Okay? Now, whether you use one or the others is going to depend a little bit. It's going to depend on if you're changing font size for particular containers. Maybe you want the sizing that you're using, like for padding and margin, to be relative to the font size for that element, or maybe you want it to be relative to the default font size for the whole page. Okay? So REM is relative to the font size of the root element. It's a little bit more predictable, maybe you could say, than the EM size. VW is relative, this is where it gets super tricky to understand, relative to 1% of the width of the viewport. So when we're using VW and VH, this is width and height, we're making our size relative to the size of the screen that we're displaying on the viewport. Okay? So relative to 1%.
So if you wanted to nav bar take up 10% of the viewpoint, like at the top,
yes,
you would say 10 VH.
Yes.
Take up 10% exactly.
That's right. So you can see how maybe that would be a useful relative measurement to use, right? And percentage, just percentage, is relative to the parent element, the size of the parent element. Okay? So you can have a play with these, but generally what you'll do is you'll find one that's behaving the way you want it to for a particular thing, and you'll just use that one. Okay, you'll find ones that you get comfortable with, that are easy for you to understand, that are easy for you to sort out when it doesn't look the way that you think it should look, and then you'll kind of stick with those.
Yeah, pick your weapon to hack and slash with the HTML.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay. So, I told you we're not going to talk. I'm not going to cover floating because it's. I find it minimally useful. You might not, though. You might really like floating. So floating leaves elements in the normal flow, but moves them as far left or as right as possible in their container. So it's really similar to margin, but it doesn't behave exactly the same way. Margin auto, but it doesn't behave the same way. So if you don't set a width on floated elements, then you can't tell they're floating. All right, so you've got to set a width on them to be able to tell they're floating. So there are reasons I don't like floating, but don't let me discourage you from checking it out. You can check it out. There's a link so you can go learn more about it. Google Fonts are cool, like Google Fonts, but I don't think I need to teach you how to use them. But if you get stuck using them, then let me know, and I'll help you sort it out. So there's a bunch of resources that I kind of referred to in the presentation. You can check those out as you like. Any questions about all that stuff? Okay, so